She was there the day the gates of Azir slammed shut. Elinia had watched as the realms burned with warp fire, torchlight and damnation. She had seen the god king and his cohorts stride out to the field of battle. She had heard the clamoring and cavorting of eyeless and many-eyed horrors, screeching "Death to the king! Death to the king!" And she had almost laughed. For was Sigmar not infallible, unkillable, immortal? Elinia wished she didn't have to choke on that mirth, now turned to poisonous black bile in her throat. Yes, in her throat and in her swollen belly. Elinia had walked across the width and breadth of Chamon among the unwashed masses. Exodites fleeing the onrushing tide of wild-eyed murderers, mutants and marauders. At night, when she huddled with the others around the dim warmth of hastily constructed fires, she heard the distant screams and smelled blood on the wind. Every morning when she awoke, more people were missing, taken in the night, no matter how many watchers were posted. She imagined that most of the travelers shared the distinct sensation of a stone sinking and settling in the pit of your guts. For Elinia, the stone never left, and only seemed to grow, feeding on her anxieties. She began to dream then, in her walking trance and in her nightmares, that something festered inside her body, pulsing tendrils wrapping around her insides, squeezing life and sustenance from them. She walked and she dreamed for days that turned to weeks. Her shoes had lost their soles, and she had discarded them for wrappings of ripped cloth from her few extra clothings. The rough paths tugged at her tired feet, but she paid it little mind. Her passenger was quiet but not still. She could feel the swimming movement, small nudges and bumps, as if the passenger were testing the confines of its cell. It grew and she walked, the lakes of quicksilver and boughs of trees giving way to sharp mountain ranges and flurries of snow. She beheld the Realm Gate, a glowing arch of intricately woven facade of blue and gold. Light spilled forth from beyond the portal to the god King's dominion. He had already retreated within his indomitable redoubt, and now Azirian plenipotentiaries guided as many through the gate as they could, hoping against hope to save as many as they could. Elinia waited. She waited and hoped against hope that she would be saved. The gate closed with a thunderclap, fitting for the god king of divine lightning, Elinia thought at the time. The crowds teeming and seething around the hill it rested upon looked on the empty doorway with dumb expressions. No golden fields of sanctuary lay on the other side. Only a framed picture of the uncaring mountaintop stared back at them through the disabled realm gate. There was shouting and screaming, but more than anything people wandered around aimlessly. It was as a Dwarden contraption had detonated amidst them, sending the tattered remnants staggering, confused and concussed out of the blast radius. Elinia felt a kick in her gut, a spiteful, gleeful kick that seemed to say, "I told you so," and she turned and left. She didn't know where she was going. The home she had known when she had a loving husband and a warm hearth and family was long since burned to the founding stones. She also knew now that a future as such in the realm of Sigmar was just as much out of reach as returning to the past. The past before the invasion, before Dodric had turned against her. Elinia wandered into the snowy hills, her feet chill and numb in thin wrappings. She wrapped her arms about herself, but it did nothing to stave off the cold. Her passenger only seemed to sap heat from her limbs rather than share it. She wandered and she slept when it became dark, out of habit more than anything else. She wandered though she did not search for anything in the blinding daylight. Rather, she thought to herself, maybe she was trying to go as far from what people searched for as she could go. She dreamed again. In inky black and glaring white, she dreamed. Again of her passenger, but this time she dreamed not of a writhing mass of black ichor, but of a man. A man tall and fair, with hair of spun gold and eyes ablaze. She dreamed of him and she spoke to him. Why are you doing this to me?" But he did not answer. A smile teased at the edges of his lips, but his countenance was a cold mask. She dreamed and she wandered. Days passed without change. Snowy hills gave way to glacier ice, but it was the same, and she walked. The ice, blasted by mountain winds, was rough and chipped. Frozen blades cut at her soles, her feet bloody, broken, blackened by frost. Her hands too were turning black from the extremities. Blood seeped slow and placid from the cracks in her skin. Elinia could not feel the skin of her face, nor see a reflection in the cracked ice, but she knew her nose and ears and lips would look the same. She dreamed and wandered and left blood footprints on the ice as she did. Elinia had been reduced to a stumbling crawl, her limbs stiff, needles of frostbite in broken fingers, the lids of her eyes frozen shut, her nose long since reduced to a lump of inert tissue. Even her hearing was dulled and muted by creeping cold. As Elinia took halting steps and pulled herself along with wood plank arms, the ice and snow gave way to shale and scree. At times she would tumble and slide, downward, deeper. Slowly she was enveloped by warmth and then heat, sweltering, stifling, sweating. She burned in the cloying wet hot. She would have screamed if her lips were not sealed shut. A final tumble deposited her battered body in a shallow crucible. Elinia drew a ragged breath in through wrecked nostrils. She was finally at rest, wrapped in a crushing embrace. She slept. When Elinia came awake again, she felt more than heard, a rhythmic beat in the chamber around her. The unrelenting tattoo was as much heartbeat as it was drumbeat. It continued. The tempo accelerated, became erratic, fibrillating, frenzied, mounting in a bone-shaking crescendo. Elinia, drowning in agonizing sensation after the bleak emptiness of the tundra, was finally given a focal point when a clammy clawed hand gently gripped the back of her head, propping it up. She could hear a cooing voice, though she did not hear it resound in her ears, but rather in her mind. It shushed her.
Be still, sweet child. Your time is near.
Her passenger, who had been nearly still during her long ordeal, kicked, and Elinia flinched at the sudden violent motion. Another hand touched her brow, and then her immobile eyelids. Though she could no longer feel them, she could feel the tug as they were pulled open by the lashes. She could see again. Her eyes watered horribly. She could barely make out blackened gums and jagged teeth and a thin liver-spotted hand wielding a crooked blade near to her eyes. She whimpered in her throat and tried to squirm, but she was beyond her limits, and the hand that had gently cradled her head now became a vice, holding it still. The blade moved closer to her eye, but rather than blinding her as she had feared, it cut away the dead, black flesh of her eyelids, deftly removing most of them, leaving her unable to blink. There was some pain, but she was almost thankful for release from the unblinking darkness. The voice she had heard came again.
You must see the birth of the Messiah. You, the vessel of his return, must be witness to his coming.
And the hand and the blade with it withdrew from her face. The grip on her head relaxed, and she could then crane her neck slightly to look around. She was surrounded by a handful of men and women naked above the waist, with wrapped skirts of tan skin covering their legs. Sigils daubed their bodies in dizzying patterns. Burning braziers dotted the chamber, casting dancing, laughing shadows on the walls. Before her, a wooden icon of an 8-pointed star stood as tall as the tallest man, and a naked body hung from its spokes, tied with rough hempen ropes at the wrists. Those same sigils in the crowd were repeated upon the body, but carved in bloody swathes rather than in paint. The body had a wide gash above the pelvic bone where the entrails threatened to vacate the cavity within. One breast was entirely removed, the pectoral musculature beneath revealed. Elinia looked again at the one who cradled her. The grinning head nodded, the rotten gums and teeth joined by brown skin drawn tight over facial bones by age and sun, and thin hair sticking in every direction. It spoke to her again.
The quickening comes. He comes.
And Elinia felt sharp, cutting pain deep in her belly. Through her watering eyes, she saw the leader take the crooked blade from the hand that had cut away her eyelids. The tip of the blade dipped down to below her swollen belly.
This will be ecstatic pain. No greater offering for our Lord.
And the point slowly pierced her skin as it dug deeper, severing flesh and sinew. Elinia screamed, a guttural noise from deep in her throat, rattling her atrophied tongue, the skin of her lips tearing in vicious tandem to the sawing of the skin of her belly. The racking pain shredded her nerves further, enjoying to a blossoming sharp-edged pleasure. Elinia had her body invaded as the clawed hand widened the rough mouth cut into her belly, the pain ripping apart the last vestiges of her senses. The other hand came away and the head lolled back. Both hands entered the cavity of her body and pulled on something within. Her passenger. The pain and pleasure doubled again as the mass was removed from her. Its strings reluctantly pulled free of her innards as it was brought out of her and into the flickering firelight of reality. The air shivered and congealed around the leader holding aloft the living being. Elinia somehow lifted her head with nothing left in her body. She looked upon a luminous being, a babe of improbable strength, lifting its own head and tiny hands in victorious glory, waves of thin blonde hair stuck to its wet body, eyes shining brightly in the gloom. The infant cried a shrill, sweet, tinkling cry, a sound tinged with portent that echoed in Elenia's head as her heart, bathed in dark light, gave out, her battered soul caving in, and she fell still, her last breath leaving her shriveled lungs, and Elinia, siress of the magnificent prince, died.